When I was a teenager in the 90s, I watched Howling 6 on TV, and I remember it being alright actually, but how would the film stand up on a second watch almost 30 years later? Let's find out. Hi guys, so before we get into it, a very quick disclaimer that you'll find all my other Howling reviews in my Howling playlist, and there will be spoilers today. So Howling 6 was directed by a woman, actually, Hope Perello. You might remember her from such acclaimed films as Pet Shop and St. Patrick's Day. Now, as I indicated earlier, I have seen Howling 6 once before, way back when, in the 90s, and funny story actually, so about 2 days after I'd watched Howling 6 for the first time, I just happened to be listening to this music compilation album called Now 30, and on that is a song called Hoochie Bootie by a band called Ultimate Kaos. They were kind of like a poor man's Jackson 5, they didn't last very long. But about 10 seconds into this song, one of the singers goes, "And this one's for the freaks," or something like that. And at the time, I thought to myself, oh, that's weird. I was watching a film called Howling 6, The Freaks, about 2 days ago. So I started listening to this song, but picturing it as a kind of unofficial soundtrack to Howling 6. I started picturing all different scenes from the movie playing out as the music was going on. And for a time afterwards, I would keep listening to that same song and picturing it as the video for Howling 6. And then in time, I forgot about the movie and I stopped listening to Ultimate Kaos. But it's weird, the things that come back to you. And if I remember, I will try and leave a link to that music video in the comments or something, just so you can tell me what you think. Anyway, the story for Howling 6, it's completely unconnected to any of the previous ones. I mean, if you're a writer in this series, why break the habit of a lifetime? We get a completely fresh, original tale here. And we begin with a random English 20-something who just happens to be wandering around one of the deserty states of America. He doesn't seem to know where he's going. He's looking for work just to tide set himself over while he remembers what his name is and where the hell he is. I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but I must interject at this point and just point out the ridiculousness of a random English guy just being lost in the deserts of America. That doesn't happen. When we Brits travel to America for a holiday, we tend to cling on to our return tickets so we can get home. We don't just wander out of the hotel on any given day and get lost in Hicksville and end up becoming like slave labour for some local pastor. It just doesn't happen in real life. But that's what happens to this guy. And so he sets about, stabilising himself and deciding what he's going to do next, which won't be easy because the pastor's daughter just happens to be one of the hottest blondes in all of America. No, seriously, this girl is easily, for me, the best looking woman to appear in any Howling movie. And I must interject again at this moment, actually, because the idea that this extremely hot blonde, who looks like she could be on America's Top Model, would just happen to be living in this random town in the middle of nowhere with a population of about 20, and seemingly she's got no interest in going off and finding hot dudes or going off and making millions out of her stunning looks. Absolutely would not happen in real life, but let's just move on past that. Now, it turns out that our English guy is a werewolf, and he really wants to kill this vampire guy who's about to roll into town, because the vampire is the head of like a carnival of freaks. It's like a travelling circus thing that goes from town to town. And so this movie is basically werewolf versus vampire. So no, that wasn't done in Twilight for the first time. It wasn't done in Underworld for the first time. It might not have even been done in Howling 6 for the first time. But out of these three examples, Howling 6 certainly came along first. But the idea of werewolf versus vampire is quite a cool concept for a Howling sequel, actually. And this all plays out against the background of this quite large carnival. And I guess the chances of success for our werewolf will depend entirely on whether he can keep his eyes on the prize and off the hot pastor's daughter. If this film proves anything, it's that you can take any horror script, add a carnival to it, or a circus or a freak show, and that script will then become instantly better. There's just something about those places that really works when it comes to horror. And off the top of my head, I can't think of a single bad horror film that has a circus or a freak show or a combination of those things. And certainly the carnival, or whatever you want to call it, in this film absolutely makes Howling 6 better. And once this place rolls into town, it's pretty much there for the rest of the movie, and they've really put a lot of effort into making this freak show really, really cool to look at from a viewer's point of view. Like, it doesn't look cheap and nasty. This film probably didn't have the biggest budget, and yet the freak show looks like it's had a lot of effort put into it. I don't know if they just rented like a local freak show or something, or whether they had to just design their own rooms and paint all the attractions and stuff and do it themselves. I don't know. But if this same freak show was in like a much bigger budget horror film like Halloween Ends, I think people would have been going up to Danny McBride after the premiere and saying, wow, that carnival that you did for this film, you put a lot of effort into that. I mean, it's a shame that Michael Myers turned up and ruined it for everyone, but still great effort, you know. Easily the best thing about Howling 6 is the scene where Ian, the English guy, and Elizabeth, the pastor's daughter, they're on a kind of unofficial date and they're just wandering around the carnival, and we're getting to see just how many exhibits they designed for this movie. It's a really cool sequence, and you're watching all these little sideshows and creepy men in paint, and you're just wondering, okay, which elements of all this are going to come back into the story later on, but in a much more sinister kind of way. Very reminiscent of an old Tobe Hooper film from the early 80s called Funhouse, which is hugely underrated. Check it out if you haven't seen it. It's up there on the level of Texas Chainsaw, but it just doesn't get any love for some reason. But in Funhouse, there's also a segment where the protagonists are just wandering around looking at like these gimmicky attractions and things, and they do that for quite a while, and it's like probably one of the best things about the film, and I don't say that in a bad way at all. The trouble is, when it comes to Howling 6, this best scene in the movie, in my opinion, also highlights at the exact same time probably the worst thing about Howling 6, which is the relationship between Ian and Elizabeth. It's just not quite done right. I don't think it's the acting. I think the script has just made Ian way too disinterested in Elizabeth, in my opinion. Number one, it's just hard to believe anybody would be disinterested in this particular actress. Number two, I've always been under the impression that werewolves are like hornier than most normal men. Is this correct, or have I just picked this up from one werewolf movie and I've taken it as gospel? I don't know. I mean, the werewolves in Howling 1 and Howling 2, I mean, they just couldn't get enough of sex. They were just at it all the time like rabbits. But Ian, even though he's a werewolf, he's just constantly turning down this really hot girl who's with him. But the thing is, it was kind of needed for this movie that these two would have a lot of chemistry, that they would get together quite early on, they would make each other laugh, and because there comes a point in this, about halfway through or maybe just past halfway, where Ian gets outed as a werewolf and he's put in this cage and taken away. Now, based on what I've seen up to this point between Ian and Elizabeth, I just don't buy it that Elizabeth would want to keep pursuing Ian now that she knows he's a werewolf and rescue him and still want to be with him, because they've just not had a good enough up to that point. Do you know what I mean? Like, but if they'd have had a really cool relationship with lots of chemistry, then yeah, I would have believed it more that she would then, you know, hunt him down, because she acts like the woman from Edward Scissorhands, you know, like he's the only one for her, just based on this one date they've been on where he was barely showing her any interest. It doesn't quite jibe for me, and in fact this whole relationship is probably what stops this film becoming an excellent horror film, instead of just being relegated to being just a pretty good one. The werewolf effects and makeup are really strong in this. I mean, given what the budget probably was, I think they did really well on that score. I mean, you don't get werewolf effects of the standard of Howling 1, but they probably look better here than they have at any time since Howling 1. There wasn't a single moment when I was watching this where I shifted uncomfortably because of a really bad werewolf effect. And I like what they did with the vampire. So when the vampire turns in this, he gets this purple head, weirdly enough, as if he's taken some Willy Wonka chewing gum. But even though it's clearly like a cheap hat of some description that reminds me a lot of the Green Goblin from Spider-Man, but purple, it looks really good actually. And I just like the overall aesthetic that you get in this film of the werewolf going up against this purple-headed vampire. It's just really damn cool. And actually, the villain, even in human form, is really strong. This is probably the best villain in the entire Howling franchise that I've seen up to this point. Yes, you would say that Howling 1 is a better movie, but Howling 1 didn't really have a villain. This film does, and he's damn good. He's played by a guy called Bruce Payne, an English actor. More Englishness for some reason. Howling films love their Englishness, even when they're not, even when the films aren't taking place in England. But this guy, Bruce Payne, he's the only actor whose name I bothered to remember for this review, because I really like him, actually. His career was very consistent all the way through, if you look it up on Wikipedia, but probably not that well known to most people, other than when he did Passenger 57 a couple of years after he did Howling 6. Now, probably even Passenger 57 is a fairly unknown movie to a lot of younger people, but at the time it came out in the 90s, it was a really big budget action Hollywood film that everybody was sort of aware of. And if you do a little bit of reading online about Passenger 57, you will see quite a few comments that sort of suggest that Bruce Payne, as the villain in that film, did kind of steal the show from Wesley Snipes, the much bigger Hollywood star. But what Bruce Payne did after Passenger 57 is totally lost to me. But still, just judging him on Howling 6 and Passenger 57, just an excellent actor and really sinister when he plays a villain. His presence in this movie definitely adds to it considerably. I also really like the minor characters in Howling 6, both on the good side, the townsfolk side, and also the villainy side. You know, the midgets and the people in weird paint and the people who eat chickens and stuff. There's just a lot of good attention to detail with the minor characters in this film. You know, like with the cop, the sheriff. At first, you think he's just another arsehole sheriff like the one from Howling 4, but then he grows into the film subtly, and then later on he's going off on his own little side mission to check out the circus, because he's a good cop. You know, he wants to follow his nose, he wants to do a good job. He just doesn't want to just be lazy and pick up his paycheck like the Howling 4 sheriff. And on the villain side, you get all these like side villains, which, although none of them are as bad as the main vampire Harker, it's really on the nose, that, but yeah, these little side villains, it's understandable why they would back up their boss. You know, I mean, they might not be naturally evil people like Harker, but you know, if you're a freak, for the want of a better word, and you know this guy's given you a home, he's made you feel like a king, then I guess you're gonna defend him to the last. You're going to follow him into villainy, and you get some good little confrontations near the end of this film, not just with Harker, but also these little side villains who just randomly turn up for these like really offbeat fights against the werewolf. So yeah, I like this film. I do think it stood up quite well to my memory of it. The film hasn't just magically gone down in my estimations because I've got a lot older and a lot more experienced with movies, and my experiences of movies have become more vast over the years as I've obviously watched hundreds more. Musically, I guess I should say a little bit about the soundtrack. I didn't notice much in the way of music in this film. You won't find Hoochie Bootie, unfortunately. I'd love to do my own edit of this film where Hoochie Bootie is on the credits, but I'll probably never get around to it. I vaguely remember a little bit of circusy type music, which absolutely fitted the movie, but overall, I'd have to just give this movie a pass when it comes to the music. I think it's just about time to go to the Bag of Terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give Howling 6, The Freaks. So we've got 1, 2, 3... 3.5 bloody axes out of 5. I actually quite like this movie. It's definitely one of the better Howling films. I wouldn't mind getting this on Blu-ray, although it probably doesn't have a Blu-ray. I'd buy a DVD for this, honestly. I can definitely see myself watching it again in future. I've got a lot of nostalgia for this film because I watched it so young, and watching it today, it still works for me. It's still a lot of fun. It's really enjoyable. And I definitely recommend that you check this one out. Now, unfortunately, I've heard that the next Howling film after this is absolutely terrible. The 7th one has a name which it doesn't have the number 7 in it. It's got some kind of title that it's not going to come to me, but I've heard it's atrocious. Now, I may have to take a little bit of a break from the Howling reviews because I've got this video coming up soon at my top 100 films of all time, which is really exciting for me personally, but it's going to take 5 videos, I think. I'm going to have to split it up because it's such a long ranking, which means I will probably be working on that for quite a few weeks. So I suspect it might be 1 or 2 months before I get onto my next Howling review. But given how bad I've heard Howling 7 is, I don't mind waiting, and I hope you don't either. Right, that's all for today. Thank you for joining me for this review, and until next time, ow!